going to finish up our series called Finding Purpose. And we are in week 5 of a 5-week series called Finding Purpose, where we've been answering some of the more difficult questions that we all wrestle with. Things like, why am I here? What's my purpose? Is there more to life than just the everyday grind? And does my life have meaning? And so far, we've established, I think, a few things as we've talked about purpose. And I think we've said it throughout this series that all of us want to know when we talk about purpose, we're usually saying, what is my specific purpose? What is my assignment in life? And that's what we call unique purpose. But we've been working down over the past few weeks to that. And we started out, first of all, looking at the broad, big picture. And we said, when you look at the big picture of purpose, the first thing you have to realize is that the source of all purpose is God. And we have to get our purpose from God, because anything else outside of God is going to be a short-lived attempt that's going to feel good and be fulfilling for a season, but it's ultimately going to leave us lacking something. So we talked about the source of purpose. Then week 2, we talked about ultimate purpose, which we said for every person who's been created, who's made in the image of God, you have to go back to this ultimate purpose of knowing God and making him known. The idea that you and I we're hardwired, it's in our DNA to know our Creator on a personal level and then reflect him and make him known so that others can know him as well. And then last week, we finally got down to what everybody was wanting to get to. We started talking about ultimate purpose, God's assignment for you. And we just kind of framed that with a couple of things. We said, one, that unique purpose isn't a fixed thing. It shifts in life's seasons. If you remember, we said that's helpful because if you go through a seasonal change in your life and you retire or you have kids or your kids grow up, all of those times can feel like a loss of purpose if you don't recognize there's a shift sometimes that happens in our purpose. But the second thing we talked about is that unique purpose isn't singular, it's multifaceted. And it's not like this one silver bullet thing, like if God just tells me this, then I know my purpose. But in every season of our life, there's multiple purposes. There's purpose that we have in our family, purpose in our community, purpose at our work, purpose in our church. And so today, we're going to continue to narrow it down. And today, we're going to talk about our work and how we find purpose there. And I'll echo what we said last week. Our work is not our ultimate purpose, but it is a part of our purpose. And I want to make sure we don't overhype work, but we also don't diminish it too much, because it does matter and it matters to God. And we're going to talk about that today. So I was writing this message, I began to think back to different jobs that I've had over the years. And I thought back to my very first official job as a teenager. Anybody remember their very first job, okay? Most likely not the peak of your career, right? Like unless you were in the NBA or something at 18 years old, not the peak of your career, definitely not mine. But my first job was working for a guy in our church who owned a grass cutting business. His name was Jackie Kelly. Jackie was 71, 72 years old. He was retired. And so this was kind of like his retirement gig. And so he was looking for a few helpers in the summer. And so he hit up my parents, and my dad's like, absolutely, they would love to have a job this summer. And so we got kind of voluntold. And so we started working for Jackie, and I grew up in Alabama, and if you've ever been in the South, the summertime's not the most pleasant time of year. Usually you're at 95, 100 degrees, crazy humidity, so just super, super hot time to be outside. And I just remember he wanted to start at 7 o'clock, and because it was a little bit cooler in the morning. So we started at 7, end at 3. And again, if you're a teenage boy, summertime, you're like, oh yeah, there went my summer, getting up early. But we would, and he was a stickler. You had to be there before 7 o'clock because we were rolling at 7 o'clock. And so one of the things, my job and my brother's job, we didn't get to ride on the riding mower. That was Jackie's job, okay? We got to use the weed trimmers or the weed eaters or whatever you call it, okay? That was our role. So 8 hours a day of just doing this with yard after yard after yard. I wish I could look back to that and say, you know what? I really saw God's purpose in that season. I can see it now, but as a teenager, that's not where my mind was, right? And that's not where most of our minds were at that time. My mind was, my dad had told me, congratulations, you have a truck now and you have your driver's license, but you get to pay for your gas. Anybody else's parents gave you that treatment, all right? And I was like, how am I going to do that? And that's where the job came in. So I saw my work as simply a way, it's just a means to an end of getting gas money. And that's why I worked. And I think the reality is, I think a lot of people, that's the way they see work. There's not a lot of purpose in it. It's just kind of a means to an end. I want to share just some stats with you from a recent Gallup poll that was done on the state of work on the globe. It says this, globally only 23% of workers are engaged in their work, while 62% are considered not engaged and 15% are actively disengaged. The crazy thing is those numbers have actually gone up in the last 15 years. They've more than doubled in getting better, but it's still really, really low. Let me share another stat with you, okay? I think it's very telling. 58% of young adults reported lacking a sense of meaning or purpose in their work, a major contributing factor to increased anxiety and depression. So 58%. Here's the really difficult part about these numbers is that we all spend a ton of our time in our life at our work. When the average American retires, they'll have spent 80,000 to 100,000 hours at work. That's between 10 and 12 years of your life there. There's a huge percentage of your life to feel devoid of all purpose. And here's the thing I think most of us know. If your life at work is devoid of purpose, we're not people who can compartmentalize things. Our life is integrated in itself. And so our work life, the feelings of lack of purpose from our work life often bleed into the rest of our life. And maybe as I'm talking about this right now, you're thinking, yeah, that's exactly where I'm at right now. I'm struggling at work. I'm struggling with purpose in my life. And so if that's you, then today's message is for you. And the sermon title of today is How to Work Without Purpose. So if you are really, really looking, you're like, okay, I have a great job, but I want to make sure I don't have purpose in my work. Obviously, I'm being a little sarcastic here. Then this is what to do, okay? But conversely, we're going to explore how to flip the script and how to live and work with great purpose and meaning and joy. And so how to work without purpose. 3 things for us today. Number 1, view work as a curse. View work in general as a curse. Think of work itself as a necessary evil. See the job that you do as a drudgery to get through. And for bonus points, if you misinterpret the Bible and support your feelings based on work, you'll definitely work without purpose. I think this mindset of work being itself a curse is guaranteed to drain every ounce of purpose from your job. But I want to ask the question, what if we've kind of had the wrong view for some of us of work? And I want to go back to the beginning of how work came into the world in the first place. And I think this will help us frame it in moving forward. The book of Genesis actually shows us in the very beginning, in the very first chapter, we meet a God at work, creating the universe and shaping it. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 2 says this, and on the 7th day, God finished his, what? Work that he had done. And he rested on the 7th day from all of his work. It's okay. I know it's a 4-letter word, but you can say it in church. It's all right. So God rested the 7th day and he made it holy because on it, God rested from all of his work. that he had done in creation. So at this very beginning, this reveals from the start that work was a part of God's nature. It's good, it's meaningful, it's purposeful. And our first glimpse of God is not a God who is relaxing on a cloud somewhere, but he's a worker. He's creating, he's forming, he's engaging his creation. And then in Genesis 1 in verse 26, God creates mankind, and the Bible tells us he creates us in his image or in his likeness. And he gives humanity this task, this work of ruling over creation. Here's what he says in verse 26. And let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And then if you skip over to chapter 2 in verse 15, it says, and the Lord God took the man and he put him in the garden to what? To work it and to keep it. Part of being human being and created in the image of God is that we're created to create, created to cultivate, to work with purpose. It's a part of our DNA. And the very first thing I think that's interesting, the very first thing that God did when he created man is he takes him and he places him in this perfect, beautiful, but untamed garden and says, here you go, get busy. You got a job, you've got purpose, bring order out of the chaos. You see, work was never meant to be a curse. It was meant to be a calling. A way for us to reflect God's character and to be stewards over his creation. Now, obviously, I know where some of you are going. You're like, well, Pastor, something happened and sin entered the world and then the curse from sin. And I get all of that, but it doesn't change the original intent. I get that work became harder, but it doesn't change the fact that it was a calling. If you keep reading in verse 28, it says, and God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now help me with what he said here. Did it say that God cursed them? And then he told them to get busy and get to work. No, it says that God blessed them. That the gift of work is actually a part of this original blessing of God, where God is delegating to humanity. I've created this beautiful place, and I've placed you in it, and now I want you to join me in this work, and I'm blessing you to do that. Now, I don't want to be naive today and pretend like every part of work feels like a blessing. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying tomorrow as you're filing that 10-page report that you hate, that you have to go, God, thank you for blessing me. This is amazing, right? I'm not saying that every coworker feels like a blessing or that there's not just some difficult things that are so frustrating about work. I get that. But the blessing of work is not always in that it's easy. It's in its potential for purpose, in its partnership with God and creativity and diligence, intentionality. He designed us to get purpose from actively engaging in the world that he's entrusted to us. And by the way, that includes raising families. That includes work at home. That's managing projects. It's innovating in your field. And so I think even in the grind, the blessing is still there. Work isn't a curse, it's a calling and it's a blessing. So first of all, if you want to work without purpose, then view it as a curse. Number two, if you want to work without purpose, then disconnect your work from God. Just completely disconnect it from God. Treat it like it's completely separate from your spiritual life. Believe your work has zero relevance in the kingdom of God, and tell yourself that God only cares about what happens on Sunday or in spiritual environments. And do that, and you'll lose purpose in work. I think a lot of us operate with this invisible wall between the secular and the sacred. We categorize some activities like attending church or serving on a Sunday. Those things are spiritual. And God is concerned about those things, right? Like he really cares about those things. But we think about our jobs, we think about errands and daily tasks. Those things are secular. They're kind of the real world. And sometimes this divide, I think, in our mind, our life, it's intentional. And sometimes I think it's unintentional. Let me explain. I think it's intentional when we have the mentality, okay, God, I'll give you Sunday, but the rest of the week, this is mine, and it's kind of off limits to you. And sometimes we kind of intentionally say that, and we have that mindset. But I think more often we unintentionally do this, and we separate the secular from the sacred by thinking that God just doesn't care about certain things. We think that God only cares about certain jobs, right? Like maybe God cares about pastors' jobs or missionaries. Maybe doctors because they really, we kind of need them and they help people. So God cares. There's a few jobs that God really cares about. But my job, well, I just do this. Or I just do that. And in our minds, we just think it's just this divide in the secular that God just doesn't really care about. And I think it's this mindset that leads to a loss of purpose. And the question is, why does it lead to that? And I want to circle back in our minds and go back to what we talked about in week 1. And we asked the question, what or who is the source of purpose? And the answer is, we got to go back to week 1. Oh, man. The answer is God. I know you guys know it. The answer is God. He is the source of purpose. And so what happens is when we intentionally or unintentionally disconnect our work from God and knowing that we're doing it as an act of worship and pleasing to Him and knowing that God actually looks at us and cares about the job that we do, when we make that disconnection, it's like our work just loses purpose over time. Let me illustrate it for you this way. I'm an 80s, but mainly a 90s kid, okay? So that's the age I grew up in, and in the 90s, and the reality is this thing has really spanned generations. So, but Ninja Turtles were a huge deal in the 90s, all right? Some of you just got more excited than anything else I said in the sermon. You're like, yeah, let's go. But Ninja Turtles were a big part of my life. I remember dressing up like Ninja Turtles at Halloween. Anybody else do that? Problem was I had black hair and the green spray paint my mom put on just didn't work. But one of the things I remember was me and my brother, back in the day, I don't know if they still do this or not, okay? But back in the day, you used to get toys out of cereal boxes. Anybody remember that? The cereal could have tasted like dog food, but that didn't matter. You would beg your mom because it had a toy in it. And I remember they were running this little series of collectibles for Ninja Turtles. It looked something like this. I don't think that's the exact one, but it looked kind of like that. And I remember begging my mom for that. And so me and my brother both got one, and we shared a room. He's about a year younger than me. And I remember our parents would tell us, like, hey, you can play with those, but once it's bedtime, you got to go to sleep. But how many of you know when you're 8 years old and you got a glow-in-the-dark toy and a flashlight, bedtime means playtime? And I remember me and my brother, we would be in our room and like I would have a Ninja Turtle and he would have glow-in-the-dark Master Splinter. And then as soon as the light would go out, flashlights would be like, it was charge time, right? And we'd start charging those things up. And then it was just like this glow-in-the-dark battle in the middle of the night. And I mean, it was epic. We'd have these huge battles and our parents would come to the room and then under the covers and then back out. And we'd just go through the whole thing. But here's the thing about glow-in-the-dark toys, especially ones that come out of cereal boxes. They don't keep their charge long, do they? They don't keep glowing forever. And we'd play and we'd fight and we would do that for a minute or two, and then all of a sudden, back to the light. And we'd recharge them again and again and again. And I think in a similar way, our work is like that. It loses significance the longer it's disconnected from God. And when we feel this, we have this divide between the secular and the sacred, our work begins to feel like a meaningless cycle of tasks and obligations, and we feel like it has no purpose in this world. And so what's the correct view of our work when it comes to God? Well, the Bible puts it this way in Colossians chapter 3. Whatever you do, work heartily. That means with all of your heart, as for the Lord and not for men. Dallas Willard would summarize it this way: there is no such thing as secular work. And the truth is that God cares about your work. He does. He doesn't see it as separate from your spiritual life. He doesn't see it as less than. When you leave church on Sunday, God's not saying to you, okay, see you next week when you come back and do the important stuff. It's not what he's saying. Matter of fact, we've said it in our church before, that church is kind of like the huddle. If you're a football fan, church is the huddle. And the Monday through Saturday, that's the play, that's the highlight. So we get to come here and we get to huddle, but then we get to be launched out. And that's the way I think God views it. And God doesn't view it as when you're having your morning time with him in the Bible, and yes, that time is special and that time is precious, but it's not like when you leave, God's like, okay, have a good time at your work. That doesn't mean anything. No, God, those things are important. He sees your work as sacred. And whether it's managing finances or teaching students or building software, caring for kids at home, treating patients, managing employees, your work matters to God. Your work matters to God. Have you ever stopped to think about the fact that Jesus spent 15 to 18 years of his life as a carpenter before he began his public ministry? At around 30 years old, 15 to 18 years, he was a carpenter. The majority of his life, 6 days a week, he spent working hard with his hands. And so we have to ask ourselves, did that time matter for him? Was God the Father, was he pleased with that time? Do you think it had purpose? Sure it did. Those years were not a pause in his mission or his purpose. They were a part of it. And through every piece of wood that he shaped, every repair that he made, Jesus was living out the purpose and the dignity of work in the way that God had created it. And so I want to encourage you, if you've made that disconnect, be intentional about reconnecting your work to God and the fact that he cares for it and it matters. And there's no such thing as the secular and the sacred. Number 3, if you want to make sure you remove all purpose from work, make work only about the paycheck. Make it about the paycheck. If you want to guarantee it's devoid of all purpose, see it as just a way to get paid. Just keep your head down, collect your check, and wait for the weekend. And convince yourself that it's just simply about survival. Let me just say this as a little caveat to the message, that I do understand that sometimes there are jobs, there are places of employment that can be a toxic environment, okay? And I'm not encouraging you in any way to stay in a toxic, unhealthy environment for the long term, okay? But let's make sure we understand the difference between toxic and healthy and all those kind of things, because I did have a neighbor one time that told me she continued to change jobs. It was her first job she'd ever had. And she said, well, it's just a toxic environment. And I said, please explain that to me. And the reason it was toxic was because they wouldn't invest in her college education. And I'm like, you've been working there how long? 3 months? And so we got to make sure we're defining toxic in the right way, okay? But I'm not advocating that you work in a toxic environment. I understand there are times, there are changes, there are seasons. But we're talking about as a whole how we view work. And if you view it as only a way to just get a paycheck, it's going to be hard to get purpose from that. Now, I want to give this analogy today and explain it this way. If you imagine that you're going on a trip to Paris, France, and all of your life, you've just wanted to see the Mona Lisa painting in person. You're like, I gotta see it. I've seen pictures of it, but I gotta see it in person. And you travel all the way to France to go and see it. And then on the day that you go there and you go to look at this world-renowned painting that you've always wanted to see, instead of looking like this is what you see. only a portion of the painting, right? Only a portion. And you go in and you look at it and you're just like, yeah, I mean, that's definitely her hands, but it's just kind of lost something, isn't it? It's lost some meaning, it's lost some purpose, it's lost some value. I imagine you would leave there and your friends are like, hey, did you finally get to see it? And you're like, yeah, kind of. But it just, I don't know, it just didn't have the wow factor with 80% of it covered in a sheet. And the point that I'm getting to is in a lot of ways, that's what we do with work sometimes. When we think about it just as our purpose is only to get a paycheck, if we're looking at our work and we're only seeing a portion of it, and it's really hard to get excited about, and it's hard to get fulfillment from our employment when we're like, it's just that. Like that's all there is. And yet God is saying to us, there's so many more purposes. My purpose in your work is also multifaceted. Let me just share a few of these. I'm going to share 5 of these very quickly with you today. But I want you to see these. Go to that next slide, if you will, Tom. Here's the 5 purposes, I think the major purposes that we see in our work, okay? And God is calling us to recognize these in our life and flesh these out. The first one is to recognize or to reflect God's image. Reflect God's image. Here's a quote by John Mark Comer. He said this: "We can glorify God by doing our work in such a way that we make the invisible God visible by what we do and how we do it." You say, how do I reflect God's image in my work? Like, do I, with everything that I do, that I make sure I get a little spiel about like, hey, this was done in God's honor? Like, do I need to put a tagline on every email? And I don't think it's necessarily that. I think for one, it starts with doing good work. Like doing a great job and giving your best as if, okay, I know in this instance, I'm serving this client and maybe this client annoys me, but I'm going to separate myself from that and say, okay, I'm going to do it for God and for his honor and his glory, and I'm going to do great work. But I'm also going to be a person who works with integrity. And I'm going to realize that the people that I work around, and they know I'm a follower of Jesus. They need to hear me talk about Jesus. Yes, it's going to naturally come out, but they're also going to see a fellow worker who truly is a person of integrity and a person who also shows love and kindness to them. Even if we disagree in some areas, I'm going to reflect God's image to them. The second purpose we find in work is serving others. Our work gives us an opportunity to meet needs. And pretty much there's probably no line of work that you're in is there not a way that you can meet someone's need, a way that you can serve others, whether it's your fellow employees, whether it's your customers, a way that you can contribute to their life, enhance their life, and make it better. And I promise you, if you make the shift between I just got to get money and I got to get paid to I'm actually trying to enhance their life, like it makes a difference. You serve others. The third one, advancing God's kingdom. Through our work, we can bring justice and mercy and Christ's love into spheres of influence. We can make a tangible impact of God's purposes, and we have opportunities to share the gospel with our coworkers and other people that we encounter through our work. The fourth one is cultivating creation. And just as God called humanity to cultivate and steward the earth, our work allows us an opportunity to improve, to create, to bring order. And for some of you, maybe you're thinking, well, I'm just not a creative. Like I get how a creative, if they're a singer or if they're a painter or some type of artist, but I just do whatever it is. But the reality is all of us are creators in some way, shape, or form. And for some of you, it's just bringing order out of chaos, right? And your thing is just organizing people or organizing events. And everybody else looks at it and goes, this is a mess and I have no idea where to start. And your brain looks at it and goes, oh, we can do this and this and this. And it just starts firing because that's the way God has created you. For others, you're just really, really good with hospitality, and you're really good at making sure everyone on the team or all of the people all of your clients are taken care of and loved and cared for. And that is you're creating a space for people. And it's a gift that God has given you. And when you use that and you use that in a way to show honor to people and honor to God, God gets glory in that, and you get purpose in that. And then the final one is this. Finally, a purpose of work is providing for ourselves. That is a part of it, right? That's a part of it. But it's also and others. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28 says this. Let the thief no longer steal. So don't steal anymore. You're a follower of Jesus. Stop stealing. But rather let him what? Labor, doing honest, what? There it is again. With his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. And I think that's a reality that all of us have to learn at some point in time. We have to grow beyond ourselves. And that is so hard, isn't it? It's so hard to grow beyond ourselves. But we begin to understand true purpose in our life in every area, but especially in our place of employment, in our work, when we realize that God is not just giving me this job so I can be blessed and I can buy new toys and new things, but God also wants me to use what he's blessed me with to be a blessing to others, to be able to give to my neighbors who are in need, to be able to give to a family that I find out through my work is struggling in a difficult season. And God has blessed me with a job so that I can also give to them. So, as we kind of wrap things up here today on this series and on this sermon, I want to challenge you to make a shift in the way that you view your work. And I want to invite you to view work as not a curse, but view it as a calling, view it as a blessing. But I also want to invite you to reconnect your work to God. And maybe for you, your brain is still turning and it's still working, and you're asking yourself, okay, but how does what I do connect to God? And how does God care about the things that I do on Monday through Friday? And I want to encourage you, continue to ask God that, continue to lean into that. But then lastly, I want to encourage you to recognize the broader purpose of God in your work. That God has so many multifaceted purposes, and the more that you lean into those purposes and fulfilling those, the more you're going to be fulfilled in purpose yourself.